Hi, welcome to the bathtub. We're eschewing the musical intros this week because I screw them up somehow every time. Um, Last week, I guess I tried to talk while I was playing it. My microphone was going crazy. So until I get some decent technical people on this shot on this stage, I'm not going to try it again. Um, we're going to talk about a writer who I found really interesting, Brian Evenson, living American writer, and yeah, I'll try to do my best to describe him. I first heard of Brian Evenson 15 or 20 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, when one of my grad students, all my grad students were great. One of my really good grad students at University of Connecticut, Aaron Sanders. Hi, Aaron. I hope you're doing well. And he has, like many of my more successful students, has gone on to become far more successful than me. And so don't look back. Don't look back. But Aaron was interested in writing about sort of quote Mormon writers who had been involved with them to some degree or another, had come out of the Mormon Church or been raised as Mormons, and he was describing several writers to me and working on a dissertation about these writers. And he was constantly telling me I should read Brian Evenson. And every time he described to me a Brian Evenson story, I immediately went, no, I do not want to read that. I don't want to read him. And one of the stories I remember Aaron telling me, just writing about and describing to me, was a story called The Brotherhood of Mutilation, which is the creepiest title I've ever heard. The Brotherhood of Mutilation. And you cannot summarize Brian Evenson's stories because just that title is just so horrifying and so horrific. And the story concerns, I'm going to do a very brief description, a church, as Aaron was explaining to me, who gave you credit for every time you remove something from your body. So it was kind of the ultimate spiritualism. The more you cut off of your body. So if you cut off 5 fingers, you have 5 steps closer to spiritual perfection or something. And so the more successful members of the church, the higher up the church, the more things they cut off their bodies. Now, that sounds pretty horrific. And it sounds nightmarish. And I said, yes, I do not want to read that story. And I thank you. I'm back on the bourbon, by the way. We got rid of that crappy wine for the Maupassant. And I'm glad to be back with the bourbon. So I avoided that story for years. I never really wanted to read Brian Evenson. The name kind of came back and forth and for many years. And then one day someone sent me this book called Last Days, which, as it turns out, the first third of this book is this novella of about 70 or 80 pages called The Brotherhood of Mutilation. And I said to myself, no, I do not want to read this book. And then I went into the bathtub. This is one of my longest baths in London. I had a really good bathtub in London, I got to say. And I started The Brotherhood of Mutilation in the tub, and I read until the water got cold. I could not put it down. It is a great page turner story. It's a detective novel set about this guy going to this church. And it's only 70 or 80 pages. And it starts off with a bizarre premise, which is this guy, something horrible has happened to him in the past. And now he's going to this place, this church. And Evenson does these kind of crazy, there's a couple of thugs who are constantly talking back and forth in this kind of ridiculous comic dialogue. His prose is really sparer than spare. There's very few images. There's very few adjectives in it, and there's not like these sharp descriptions. They're very narrative sentences, and I can't describe more than that. But you're not going to pick out. No single sentence is going to call attention to itself. He's a very narrative writer. Now, one of the things that's fascinating in the story is that basically this guy goes off to solve a murder at this church. It's a hilarious story, and as he gets to the church, he finds out that all the elders, the people who are in a position to give information about this murder, are so important that nobody can, they can't say anything. No one can talk to them. They've divorced themselves from their limbs and from reality and from human life so much that you can't get to them to talk to them. And they send down these statements that have been redacted, like a Trump document that have just, there's nothing in it except redactions. The story is really funny. It keeps getting more and more complicated. And I remember saying this once before somewhere, that when I was reading the story, I remember thinking all the way through, this is a great story. There's no way he can end this story. You can't. It was such a tangle, such a brilliantly fascinating, fun tangle. And I kept getting closer and closer to the end of the story, and I kept going, you can't do it. I was kind of gleeful because I was a little jealous of this story. It was a brilliant story. And by the time I got to the end, there's like 2 pages, bang, bang, and Evenson hits just the right notes. And the last line's a killer line. And it's just a brilliant story. So it's a wonderful short novel. It's worth buying this book, Last Days, just to read that. Now, I became an Evenson fan at that point. And there's a sequel in this called Last Days, which I have never read. It is a sequel to the previous story. And I never read it because that first story was so perfect. You just did not want to. It's like I didn't want to read anything more in that world. It closed off so perfectly. I didn't want to go back. So I don't. The second half maybe is as good, but I didn't read it. Several years later, I read Immobility. I read many of his stories, and a couple of he writes collections of stories every 3 or 4 years. We'll talk about those in a minute. Immobility is a Beckett-like science fiction novel set after the apocalypse. The visions in every Evenson novel are totally dark. They're Ligotti-like dark stuff, but like Ligotti, very funny, and little twists in the narrative. But they're very dark universes. And then this is the future. Basically, everyone's been pulverized, or they're turned into hulking mutant messes. And there's a guy, I can't remember the story. It's been 7 or 8 years. I read it when it came out. Who's walking through this vast wasteland. It's like Fallout, the game Fallout, and everyone's a mutant and twisted in various ways. And he's got these. He's carrying. Oh no, he's immobile. He can't move, and he has these 2 guys carrying him around. And these 2 guys like Frick and Frack. They're constantly talking these crazy things. It's a very funny, horrific. You can't put this down either. The Open Curtain I'd read. This is the one that's sort of set in the Mormon Church and set in Salt Lake City. Again, I first thought of him as a Mormon writer. It has nothing to do with it. His involvement, he was as a young man in the church, and he definitely writes about that church, and people in the church in the Open Curtain, and he's interested in kind of religious orthodoxy and extensive and intense orthodoxy. But you don't need to. It has nothing to do with it. You just pick up his stories and you'll like them. So the other day I was lucky enough to review for the New York Times 3 books of stories, and easily the best of them was the new Brian Evenson's collection, Song for the Unraveling of the World. I'm not going to try to summarize these stories or read excerpts from them. It is really dark and disturbing and funny. But because the stories are so beautifully put together, however dark and disturbing they are, you just still enjoy them. So it is part of it's back to de Maupassant. De Maupassant argued, I can talk about horrible people and horrible things happening to them, but if the art is there, Flaubert is always saying, if the art is there, then it's still a beautiful experience. And these are really incredible, strange stories. He goes over certain riffs. He keeps doing similar riffs of people who are dissociated from their own lives, dissociated from their own bodies often, dissociated from the landscapes they're in. There's sometimes science fiction worlds, they're very often psychological maps in which the central characters, many of his central characters are horrific people. He reminds me a little of Nabokov in that sense, that the central characters are really awful sometimes, and they're sometimes child molesters or child kidnappers, and they're often getting into, they can't tell what they're really thinking from what they want to believe. And they go down these little Mobius loops, very David Lynchian type stuff, if you like David Lynch, which I do. I don't want to talk, there's nothing I want to talk, there's some movies, 2 or 3, he does obsessive characters. So there's at least a couple of stories here about guys who are obsessed with getting the film stock or the background shots for film about murders. They're so obsessive about this particular quality that they actually get lost in the films they're making. And there's 2 or 3 of those that, again, you can almost see that Evenson, certain movies and certain books have really stuck with him, and you can just come see him doing Blow Up. The great Antonioni movie Blow Up. It's almost like he's doing these different riffs on Blow Up several times, but they're totally original. They're not derivative in any way, but they're definitely influenced. So I would really recommend. He's got a lot of short story collections. The newest one is this, and I haven't read all of his collections. I've read a couple of other ones, and I think they get better. I think he's actually much better than the first early ones, which were interesting. But I would start with this. Start with the latest one and work your way backwards. I think that's a good way with Evenson, and you can't really go wrong. I can't think of any of the books that aren't worth trying. But the new one's great. I'll post a little link to my review of Brian Evenson's Song for the Unraveling of the World, an appropriate title for our times, I'm afraid. And we'll see you next week in the bathtub. Bye. But learn how to turn this thing off.